Okay, good morning, everybody. And in just over 2 weeks' time, the transition period ends and the UK will be beginning a new relationship with the European Union. Obviously, at this point in time, negotiations are still ongoing on the terms of a possible free trade agreement between the UK and the EU. And as the Thoroughbred Industry Week, we very much hope that one is reached. However, as this is not yet concluded, and even if one is reached, we believe there'll be fundamental changes to how we move horses that will come into effect on the 1st of January. Therefore, thought it would be helpful for members to have this session today so that we can answer as best as we can at this point in time any questions that you may have about the new arrangements and how it will affect your breeding operation. As Charlotte mentioned, please do use the Q&A facility. We'll endeavour to answer as many of them as we can in the time that we have available today. And if there are any that we can't answer, we will get back to you as soon as we have the answer. So I will start with giving a brief overview and then we'll go into the broader Q&A session. So what do we know? Firstly, we know the UK will be a third country in the eyes of the EU, and that will come under their third country regulations. Those breeders that import or export to Australia or the United States will already have some experience of this. But what we can definitely say is that the relationship will change. And this is regardless of whether there's a free trade agreement or not. The free trade agreement could remove some of the tariffs that may become applicable on goods, but will not change the fact that as the UK will be leaving the EU single market and the customs union, there will therefore be a border with the EU and certain checks will be required and custom requirements to be made. The tripartite agreement will end on the 31st of December 2020. It's part of EU law, and as we finally leave the EU and the transition period ends, it will no longer apply. All this means, in summary, that movement processes are likely to be more complex, especially those between Britain and Ireland, where previously there have been no requirements of movement has been as simple as loading up the horse box with your passport and travelling across the Irish Sea. And for all these reasons, at this point in time, we recommend that you appoint a shipper, a transporter and customs agents to help you through these processes. Next slide, please. So both the UK and the EU will want to protect their animal health status to avoid the transmission of disease. The EU have stated animal health regulations for third countries, and thoroughbreds will come under the registered horse rules. And whilst we don't have confirmation yet, we're expecting that the UK will be placed in the highest category for their health standards, which would mean the following. You'll need to enter the EU via a recognised border control post for equines. Requirements will then include blood testing for EIA and EVA, residency requirements, which basically means keeping it on a UK holding under veterinary supervision. You'll need to apply for an export health certificate and complete the supporting documents. And you'll need to travel with your Weatherby's horse passport, which will qualify as valid equine ID. The UK will be phasing in its border controls over a period of 6 months. Therefore, if you're importing back into the UK before the end of June next year, you can come in via any port and with your Weatherby's passport. The exporter will need an export health certificate from the country of origin, and you'll just need to pre-notify the UK government using the new IPAFS system. Next slide, please, and Peter Mendham is going to talk to us about customs processes.
Good morning. As Claire has already said, that whatever happens with the discussions with the free trade agreement, customs processes will change. So customs processes will change and documentation will have to be produced. Now, one of the key elements of that is that you must have an EORI number, which you obtain from HMRC. They've been writing to about registered people and others for several months now, requesting and urging people to get this number. And it is absolutely vital that you do that before the 1st of January. It's quite a simple process. It can be done online. And to do that, for any of you that don't have the number, just go to gov.uk, the HMRC section, do a search on EORI, and it will take you through to the application process. But the only thing that you do now, this is the most important. Customs declarations have to be made, and over time they've become much more reliant upon computer declarations, and it's not very simple to do that. So we strongly recommend that you speak to a shipping customs agent to get them to help you with the documentation. They will have the wherewithal to lodge the documentation with HMRC, and they will be able to take you through the procedure. The declarations have to be made. This is both ways. That's going out of the UK and going into the receiving country. So it's vital you get the documentation right, because the last thing anybody wants is for horses to be stood around at ports and airports because the paperwork is deficient in any way. You have to put a value on the horse, and you have to ascribe a commodity code. And again, the commodity code, you can speak to the agent, he will have that. It's one code for breeding horses and one for non-breeding. Valuation is it's the best estimate of what you think at the time. I mean, obviously, if a horse has been subject to a recent transaction, there will be a determined value. But other than that, it's a reasonable assessment of the value, and that must be declared. HMRC have got quite a lot of helpful guidance on the HMRC website, and I would recommend that you look at that. Also look at the industry sources of information, the BHA website. There's some helpful questions and answers on there. If you're not sure, take advice, because it can be costly to get things wrong. And as I said earlier, it's essential that you get the paperwork right to make sure that the costs are minimized and the delays are minimized. One other area that you need to think about is to make sure that you get the customs procedure codes correct. These are recorded on each of the entries, and broadly speaking, I would recommend a conversation with your shipping agent to determine which is the appropriate one. It may be this is a temporary movement or a permanent movement, and the codes for those will be different. But your shipping agent will be able to give you advice and guidance on that, and then they will be able to complete the documentation correctly. Currently, if you import a horse from the States, you have to pay the VAT and then wait to recover it on the next VAT return. One of the few benefits of these changes is that in future, anybody importing a horse from a third country or any other goods from a third country, they no longer have to pay the VAT over at importation. VAT registered importers would just book entry on the VAT return on their next VAT return and take a corresponding deduction for that. So there's no cash actually changes hands. You still have to record it, and HMRC will, I believe, be issuing statements based upon the import documentation that you've submitted to ensure that you get the figures correct for the VAT return. Similarly, horses leaving the UK to go to the EU or anywhere else in the world now, if you can provide proof of export, that immediately discharges any VAT liabilities that you have, and there'll be nothing to pay. But you must keep proof of export. It probably sounds worse than it is. It's getting, I think the most important thing is to think ahead for movements and speak at the earliest opportunity to whoever you ask to help you with the declarations. The more time you can give them and get the documentation prepared correctly, the smoother things will go. It will be tough anyway. We all hear of these dreadful stories of delays, so you don't want to make them worse by having poor documentation. So think ahead.
Okay.
Get that EORI.
Thank you, Peter. So what we'll do now is we've had a number of questions sent in advance, so thanks very much for that. And I'll be asking Peter and Kevin for their responses to the questions, and then please do post any further ones as we go through. So the first question asked was, what could be the key challenges with the movement of horses from the 1st of January? Peter, would you like to start?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to accepting and realizing that you have to lodge customs declaration. This is purely from the customs side, not the animal health side, that you have to prepare customs declarations. And that means speaking to an agent like Kevin, who will then guide you through the process. They're used to doing it. They've done it before. Kevin was probably doing it before we went into the single market. So there is it's not completely new to everybody, but it is complicated. So speak to the agent. Kevin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, operationally, there are going to be quite a number of changes. Depending on what deal there is and what the final arrangements are, whether we have to go, at the moment they're still talking about entering the EU via a border control post, with the possibility of horses being unloaded and inspected. We'd like to think that in the scramble post deal, that kind of nonsense can be negotiated away. It is going to be a bit more complicated. I think coming here is probably going to be easier than going there, because there's more flexibility on this side. But I think the important thing is just to plan ahead. We've got so used to ringing up on a Monday morning and wanting a horse moved to Ireland on Tuesday or Wednesday, and that's just not going to be possible in the short term. As we get used to it, and some of the more complicated restrictions are hopefully negotiated away, we might get some kind of return to normality. But for the first 6 months at least, I can't see. You're going to need at least 2 or 3 weeks notice before we move a horse. It just requires planning ahead.
Yeah. So what would a breeder need to do now, or say in January time, if they wanted to travel the horse to the EU within a period of time?
To the EU, they're going to have to ring their transporter or their agent and say, look, we've got these horses, we want them to go to Ireland. At the moment, we fully expect that they're going to require some form of blood testing. Now, as we all know, all thoroughbreds are tested for the 2 diseases in question anyway. The problem that's going to arise is that those blood tests will have to be done at the APHA, not in Rossdale's or NEH. It's my view that laboratory is not going to be able to cope with the volume, although they keep assuring us that they will. But that's based on the fact they're not coping with the volume this week, let alone when everybody starts testing broodmares. We'll then apply for a health certificate. Health certificate turns up at the vets. The vet signs it off. The horses and their health certificates then get on the lorry. Well, actually, before they get on the lorry, we can't even make a ferry booking until we've made the customs declaration. The ferry companies are not going to accept you just booking a horse box on a ferry. They want the customs declaration done. So assuming that the knotty problem of transporter authorizations is resolved, we then make the customs declaration. Going into Ireland, the next thing we would be looking to ascertain is who's going to put up the surety for the VAT, the Irish VAT. Is it going to be, has the Irish stallion farm got a bond arrangement? Or is the owner going to have an Irish bank account that's capable of producing a letter of guarantee, or pay a cash deposit? As Peter explained, coming back this way is much easier because you do it through your VAT return. But going into the EU, we've only got those 3 obvious ways of dealing with deposits for temporary exports. That's fair enough, isn't it, Peter?
Yes, it is, yeah. Yeah. And that is going to be a major problem. I mean, I suppose the bigger players will be able to resolve this, but it's the people who do it less often, it's going to be difficult. And the financial institutions are not used to doing it. So I'm sure there'll be lots of bureaucracy to work through to get some kind of security from them. The problem with putting up a cash deposit is that it's the time that it takes to come back. even when the horse, you can show that the horse has come back, it's getting that deposit released and repaid. Currently, it takes quite a long time. Kevin will know exactly how long.
6 to 8 weeks, we always say.
But with greater demand, you can only think that period will get longer.
Correct.
Excellent. So what will I have to do differently if I'm sending mares to Ireland or France for coverings for the 2021 breeding season? Firstly, if they're sending a mare to Ireland or France, and secondly, when I bring them back into the UK.
Well, I think Kevin has covered most of that in the previous answer. It's you have to complete customs declarations in both directions. You've got the issue of securing the potential charges in whichever country you go to by some form of security or cash deposit. And then coming back, it shouldn't be a problem because they'll be returned goods. You may have to account for VAT on the cost of the covering, but that VAT would come through, if you're VAT registered, that would work through the VAT return. So it's just a recording declaration rather than.
Similarly, any foal at foot, Peter. If you've got a mare that foals in Ireland and she has a foal, the foal will be a one-way. It'll be a permanent import or a first-time import, and you'll need to pay VAT on the foal.
Yeah, because it's a separate thing now when it comes back.
Okay, and will those requirements change whether it's a temporary or a permanent import or export? For example, if somebody's just going over a short period of time to get their mare covered in a 16-day pregnancy, would those things all still apply?
Temporary they would. Permanent, if you treat the outward movement as permanent, you'll end up paying VAT in the country in which the mare has gone. So you would want to do it on a temporary basis because otherwise that VAT, in theory, you could get it back, but that takes even longer. And there's some question marks about whether that process would actually work. I think most people will do it on a temporary basis, temporary movement declarations, but it is this security question that's the problem, I think.
Claire, it's important to stress at this point that you were talking about the health certification. The temporary export health certificate or the permanent export health certificate are unrelated to the customs arrangements. So you can send a horse temporarily for VAT purposes on a permanent health certificate and the other way around. The two things are disconnected. So whichever way whichever was the easiest for you would be the way that we would do it. So horses may well be going on a permanent health certificate, but they'll always be declared as temporary exports, temporary imports into Ireland, and then returning goods coming back. So we can get the surety back, clear the bond, or just to make sure there's no VAT payable.
Excellent. And Kevin, you mentioned sort of travelling foals. Are there any, I think there's been some questions around whether foals will be able to travel. Is there any sort of further news on that from your perspective?
There's no further news at the moment. I mean, we've all got used to the fact that intra-community trade counts a foal as a part of the same epidemiological unit as the mare. So a young foal at foot is treated as part of the mare. The EU for third country trade treats it as a separate animal. And of course, it requires that the animal has been isolated from others not of the same health status for 30 days, which automatically means the foal has to be 30 days old in order to obtain a health certificate. There are ongoing discussions because there is an argument that this is an unnecessary step and it has welfare implications. It starts to encourage people to take foals off away from their mares, send the mares for covering, and be putting foals onto other mares, bottling them while the mare goes over for 24 hours and this sort of thing. So there's a reasonable chance that will not be a problem further down the road, but on day one it could well be still an issue.
I know that particular issue has been raised at sort of the highest level with the Commission, isn't it? And
Yeah.
clarification sought on what the outcome will be. But as you say, as of today, we don't have a definitive answer on that, do we? But
No.
it's an area that we're particularly obviously looking for clarity on. I've had a question from the audience, which I'll read next. Do we know whether any excise duties will be levied post the 1st of January for a temporary export, say to Ireland, or to return to the UK, either for breeding or racing? And does it differ where breeding the mare could be in Ireland for over 90 days?
Well, yeah, there will certainly be no excise duties because they're just on drink and tobacco, etc. Customs duties, the only animals which will be subject to potentially any customs tariff will be geldings, and that will be something that may well be affected by if there is a free trade agreement. But currently the position is that you would pay 10% on a permanent import of a gelding coming into the UK, and going the other way into the EU from the UK on a permanent basis, it will be 11.5%.
Okay.
So it's really as simple as that. I would expect, because the UK has done away with most of its tariffs, there are actually very few items now that will be subject to tariff going forward. But unfortunately, geldings is one of those. But I would expect that if there is a free trade agreement, that would disappear. But at the moment, that hasn't happened. So you would be prepared to, that's an additional cost, and that cost gets added into the value for VAT purposes as well. So there is a real cost with duty because you can't recover it.
Yeah, I think it's important to stress that the duty on geldings is a peculiarity of the EU. There's no other trading place in the world that singles out geldings for 11% duty. And it's always been, since the single market, it's always been a source of annoyance that if you bring a gelding in from the States or from Hong Kong gelding coming to race, it has an 11.5% duty issue on it coming into the EU. Whereas there's no other jurisdiction in the world that charges duty. As Peter says, if we get a free trade agreement, we might find that the duty problem goes away. But in the event of no deal, then that would be the EU's position. And I think we would, as Peter says, reciprocate with 10%.
Yeah, any horse coming in on a temporary basis wouldn't have to pay the duty. It would be treated. It's just deferred pending re-export.
It makes your bank guarantee bigger because you have to guarantee the duty as well as the VAT.
Yeah.
And we've got a few more sort of VAT and customs related questions. As a UK VAT registered business using services in France, will we continue to receive invoices with no VAT from January the 1st, 2021?
Yes, you should do, because the reason you don't now is that you're in business in another country. Now, historically within the EU, one of the ways of demonstrating that has been to provide your VAT number to your supplier. In future, you would have to demonstrate some proof that you're in business, but a UK VAT number would still be provided to give that proof. So it shouldn't change. It shouldn't change.
Okay, and do I need to make a customs declaration even though I'm only taking the horse temporarily out of the country? I think you've already answered that one, haven't you? That regardless of whether it's short or longer term, a customs need to be made. So other than speaking to an expert on it, how do I go about doing the customs paperwork?
Well, my advice would be, don't try and do it yourself. I mean, I've been in this field for many years, and if I wanted to start today to complete customs declarations, I would be lost. You have to register with HMRC. You have to have computer links. It's very, I would say, almost impossible now to do it as an individual, isn't it, Kevin?
It is, yeah. If it's all done online through a system called Chief, and a Chief terminal costs you about 10,000 quid. You really do need to be banging a lot of customs declarations through it. The only ones that I do nowadays are when we have a horse that's coming from, say, a third country as a temporary import, and then during the period of its temporary import decides it wants to stay here permanently. So we bring the horse to account. And then I get out my 8-part green form, stick them in a typewriter and type up a customs entry, just like we did in the dark ages before 1900, and send with a check to customs, who then clear the horse to home use. And it's only those post-entry amendments that you can do manually or yourself without a chief terminal now.
Yeah. So it's virtually impossible. Speak to an agent.
Correct.
Okay, so I mean, all of what you've sort of outlined is sounding quite expensive. So what costs will I incur that I would not have incurred before?
Well, your blood tests, you're going to be doing those anyway. You might find that in the event you have to use APHA, they're going to be more expensive. Health certification, if required, is going to be probably about 100 quid by the time you pay the vet. Then you've got customs entry at both ends, and possibly the hassle of if the Irish stud that you're visiting, for example, doesn't have an open bond for the surety, you're going to have the cost of the bond for the VAT in the Republic. So it's going to be quite a bit more expensive.
Okay. So next question is it realistic to think you could walk a mare in to be covered in March this year, or should we be thinking about sending these mares to Ireland to foal and then be covered?
I think it will be doable. I think it will be doable, especially by March. I wouldn't want to be walking one in on the 14th of February, or taking one over in late January, in mid-January to foal, so that it can be covered early in the season and then brought back. But I would think by March, a lot of the issues will have been ironed out. It'll be a much more well-trodden path, and it'll be a degree of normality return to it.
Yeah, it's just keeping an eye on developments, isn't it? How things develop over the next 3 months.
Yeah, and obviously, as we are now, we're basing our advice and the decisions, obviously, that we can put out there based on EU third country health regulations. As you say, some of that may be negotiated.
Yeah, I mean, for the since the late 60s, we've moved thoroughbred horses between Ireland and France without any health certification. There's no scientific justification to go to full health certification now. It's simply a legal requirement. So we have to say that must be negotiable. It was negotiable in the 60s, and it can't be beyond the wit of man that even if it's imposed on us in January, by some point early next spring, there can have been a degree of negotiation on that point.
And also been asked to ask you both to speak about breeding mares coming in from Ireland and France with a single mare, a mare with foal at foot, i.e. seasonal mares, staying temporarily for UK stallion services.
Well, I think it's going back to what we've already said, that you'll need to obviously lodge customers documentation, leaving Ireland, coming here, going back to Ireland, leaving here, going back to Ireland. Most of these will be done on a temporary basis, which will require some kind of security to be put up for the charges in the UK. The UK is certainly saying that there'll be no special procedures for horses. It's a common security arrangement for any goods coming in on a temporary basis. So you will need to have some form of security or cash deposit available when the horse arrives. That all has to be arranged before it gets here. Otherwise, the horse will just stay and wait to be cleared. Do you agree, Kevin?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if the owner of the mare coming from Ireland has a VAT registration, it's very much easier. because
Yeah.
it just goes through their EORI number and pops up on their VAT return. It's when the mare is owned by a non-VAT registered individual that some form of surety has to be put up. The health certification issue coming in from Ireland is fairly straightforward. It's very similar to the other requirement, and I'm sure the UK government would love to drop it if the EU drop theirs. And we don't have any threat of border inspection. It's basically you land in Holyhead and drive to the farm. So it's much more seamless coming in.
Yeah.
Excellent. And final question. So what would be your advice to small breeders at this point in time, and given what we know?
Well, I think in terms of documentation, if you do intend to move a mare to another country, get in touch with an agent to prepare it for you, to hold your hand. I think other than that, it's weighing up the options as whether you want to do that, whether you want to go through that process. I mean, that's a commercial decision as much as anything else. But certainly if I had a mare and I had a choice of similar stallions, I'd be doing it here if I could, rather than going through this process. But that's a commercial decision. There will be additional costs, as Kevin has said, and some of them will be unforeseen costs. So that at the bottom, you know, where the nomination fees are lower and it's the values are lower, it can really impact upon the commerciality of sending a mare outside. But yeah, that's for the breeder to decide really. But I would give that serious consideration.
Kevin,
Yeah, that's fair enough. I mean, the costs are fixed. You know, whether your mare's worth 10 grand or $1 million, the cost of the certification, the blood testing, the transport, the customs entries is all the same. So whether you're visiting a €300,000 covering stallion or a €3,000 covering stallion, your cost base on that perspective is the same. The hassle factor of getting the bank guarantee is likely to be the same, albeit the more valuable mare is going to have a bigger bond put up. But then again, is probably more likely to have the Irish stallion farm with an open bond that would guarantee the surety for you. What I've said to breeders is, you know, don't let it put you off making the right commercial decision for your mare. So, you know, if the perfect nick and the really hot stallion happens to be in Ireland, and that's what you want to do, get on and do it. But just be aware that there is going to be a slightly higher cost level, and bear that in mind when doing your negotiations on the nomination.
Yeah, good advice.
good. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we've been asked. So if we could just go to the next slide, please, Charlotte. Obviously, you know, if you think of anything else after today, as this has prompted you to think of some more questions, please do email us at the TBA. There's two sort of valuable resources available, obviously specifically sort of for racing and breeding. The TBA on its website has got a page on the UK transition and signposting to many of the valuable resources that's available. So please do visit there. There's more comprehensive information available on the BritishHorseRacing.com website, and that's being kept up to date as information has been coming through, which is obviously happening on a daily basis. And I think we would plan to do another one of these possibly early in the new year, once there's sort of greater clarity and whether we know whether there's a free trade agreement or not. So I think that's it from me. If I'd hand over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Claire. Just to thank today's speakers, Peter and Kevin, thanks so much for your time and your wisdom answering all of these very complicated questions. I'd just like to thank everyone else for joining us today. We hope you think that the webinar's been helpful. We tried to answer as many questions as possible, but if you do have any other Queries, please do email us at info@thetba.co.uk, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. And just a reminder, as Claire said, monitor the TBA website for future webinars. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for our speakers.